So you are here for OpenTelemetry maintainers track session. I will talk about OpenTelemetry and how to get involved into it, what it consists of. I'm Sergey Kanzhelev. I'm from Microsoft.
I'm Tristan Sloughter. I'm from Postmates.
Hi, I'm Kleinknecht. I'm from Google.
And McLean, also from Google. So I assume that most people here, because this is the maintainers track talk for OpenTelemetry, already have at least a cursory understanding of what the project is. For those who don't, OpenTelemetry provides the components that you need to extract critical information about your application's performance and about any outages or other problems you have. Specifically, that means that you can extract distributed traces and application metrics. We provide all the components you need to do that. We have an API that defines these, so you can use the API to define a trace, define a span, capture a metric, or capture metadata. Next, we have integrations. As I mentioned in our talk yesterday, these are sometimes overlooked, but they're in some sense the most important part of OpenTelemetry and the projects that led to it, OpenCensus and OpenTracing. These integrations are the reason that when you link OpenTelemetry to your application and instantiate it, you don't need to go and use the API and manually instrument your whole app. That would be very painful. These integrations exist so that you don't have to do that. And they exist for things like HTTP client libraries, RPC client libraries, storage clients, etc. All the components that you really want to capture data from. Next, we offer libraries. These are the actual implementations. Exporters, which is the way that you send captured telemetry to your backends of choice, and we support many of them. And finally, a collector. Chris is going to do a deep dive on each of these coming up.
Thank you, Morgan. So in addition to being a collaboration between OpenTracing and OpenCensus into a new single project, there's many contributors across the industry from APM vendors like Datadog, Google, Azure, Dynatrace, as well as end users like Postmates, Zillow, PagerDuty, and we also have a broad range of language library support from your usual Java, Python, Ruby, Go, all the way to Erlang, Elixir, and Rust coming. The project was only announced in May, but since then we've got close to 200 individual contributors taking part, and it's growing every day. Hopefully some people in this room will add to that number.
OpenTelemetry defines 3 types of participation. It's kind of levels. And the philosophy of OpenTelemetry participation and membership is that your contribution defines your participation. So there are rules to become an official members of OpenTelemetry. It's very easy, but there are rules. You need to demonstrate code reviews. You need to do issue triage to become an approver. And then to become a maintainer, you need to demonstrate some continuous commitment to the project and understand the values of it and make sure that you go into the same directions as everybody else. Click. So when so many people going together and building something, we need to make sure that we all go into the same direction. And as Tristan said, we already have so many members that we needed to think about governance structure from early on. When we think of governance structure, we put members top and front. So maintainers of individual components has a lot of autonomy, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and when they're doing it. Members of OpenTelemetry elect governance that upholds and protects the vision of the project. So we're all doing the same thing. But then governance enforces this vision through technical committee, which you all can participate in if you demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of the project. Technical committee defines specification that guides all the members. So it's a perfect trifecta of powers, but again, members are front and center. As Morgan said, OpenTelemetry is a complete solution for telemetry collection needs. As any complete solution, it has so many components and modes of operations. Sometimes it may be hard for you to understand where to get started, where to get involved. And in this presentation, Chris will walk us through OpenTelemetry, how it works, and which components are involved to make it happen. And then he will simplify it for you by saying what components you need to pay attention to depending on what role you are. With that, I'm passing to Chris.
Okay, so I'm going to talk through the components of the libraries, and then hopefully by the end of the talk it'll be clear why we split them up this way, and then depending on what you're working on, what part of the library you should be working on. That is, if you're working on it at all. So we get like a quick show of hands. Who is actually using OpenCensus or has used OpenCensus? Nice, actually it's a lot of people. All right, how about OpenTracing? OpenTracing users? All right, more users than OpenCensus. So hopefully if you've used either of the two, this will look pretty familiar. Yeah, that's okay. Okay. So yeah, Ted points out we could use OpenTelemetry to debug the latency of the clicker. So this should hopefully look pretty familiar. We're looking at a trace here, and the span in the middle has some attributes, and this is being displayed in Jaeger, which is another CNCF project. So the actual thing that the library needs to do is produce these spans, right? So hopefully this will look pretty familiar too. Basically what we've got here is a set of services, your upstream services, your downstream services. They're color-coded in the image, and a trace by itself describes the flow of a single request through a collection of services, and then the individual span is the thing that we care about producing from our library in the case of tracing, but the span is only useful in context, which is where the other libraries here, or rather the other services come from. So we're basically trying to do three things, right? We're trying to instrument, we're trying to propagate the context between the services, and then we're trying to send the spans that we create off to specific backends. And so this is kind of, these are three different flavors of the same type of work, which is instrumentation. So looking at the concerns this way, right, we have instrumentation, context propagation, and exporting. Instrumenting code, it actually looks like putting the OpenCensus or OpenTracing or now OpenTelemetry library in your library, if you're a library owner, or your application, if you're an application owner, and using this to create spans for like some useful work. And here you can see the useful work is called give KubeCon talk, and we're trying to instrument give KubeCon talk, so we're going to create a little span to wrap this. All of these examples are going to be Python for two reasons. First, Python is hopefully close enough to pseudocode that everybody can read it and see what it's doing. Second, because I'm the maintainer for the OpenTelemetry Python client, so if you are interested in Python, you should come talk to me and we should work together. So the second thing we have to do is propagate context. This is handled by some libraries that are not OpenTelemetry. Like if you know gRPC context in Java, or if you're familiar with Go, they have this like capital C context. That is usually in-process context propagation. What we're trying to do is between-process context propagation. So we've got two things. We take the context from the wire, put it in the application, and then we do the same thing in reverse on the way back out. And you can see here we're doing this by way of a couple integrations, right? So we're saying use B3 as the format for the trace metadata. This is if you use Zipkin, you're using B3 format. And then we've got a Flask integration. Flask is a web framework for Python that is dealing with the incoming requests, and then we're using a request integration. Requests is a library, again, in Python for making HTTP requests and attaching request metadata on the way out. Last thing we got to do is ship it off to a backend. Jaeger is an example of the backend from the first slide. And the way this works is basically just in config. So this is not on the hot path of the application. This is something you would do separately. You're going to, in step 1, instrument your application, and now in step 3, you're going to configure it. And so we'll see in a minute that these can actually be different people doing the instrumentation and configuration. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how the components are split up in the library, and we're going to talk through the 5 components that Morgan mentioned at the beginning. I know this is kind of a slide full, but hopefully you can see the important thing here is that the OpenTelemetry client libraries are split into separate API and SDK packages, and that those have different audiences and different concerns. So, who here is a application owner? Like, you own a application, you instrument it? Great, a lot of hands. How about a standalone library? So this is not something that you maintain? Great, awesome, as a service, just something that other people will use. Last thing, who works for an APM, like the data dogs of the world, the Dynatraces? Nice, Dynatrace in the front row over here. So, application owners, back to this diagram, you can see the thing that you care about, hopefully, is your application business logic. You want it instrumented, you're going to create spans in the business logic. There, you're only going to depend on the API. Right, so the API is this, it's two things. It is both a set of interfaces that we instrument and implement using the SDK, and it is a minimal implementation that does things like context propagation for you. So it's confusing that it's called API, but it includes some implementation, and the SDK also includes some interfaces, but you bear with me, we call them API and SDK. So that's your application logic, and then at configuration time, you're going to want to pick a particular version of the implementation of the API and load that version. And we'll see why you'll do that in a minute when we get to APM vendors. So you might do both of these things if you're both using third-party libraries that have some other implementation, or rather, that have some instrumentation that you don't control, and you've got your own business logic that has instrumentation you do control, and you want to pick a particular implementation to use at configuration time. Now, if you're a library owner, you're also going to depend on the API, but that's it. A library owner will never depend on the SDK. Now, if you're an APM, things get more complicated. Usually what you'll want to do is ship your own exporter. So this will take OpenTelemetry data, it'll convert it to the shape that you need for your backend, and it'll do the actual work of shipping it off to the backend. You can also, if you want to, completely rewrite the SDK. Now, this is if you need to make like some invasive changes, if you want to have actions that happen as spans start and end, or you might do both of these things and basically just use the minimal implementation of context propagation and the set of interfaces in the API. So, those are the three people, the three personas that might use the library and why they might use them. These are the different components. Do we have any questions about the personas real quick before we jump onto components? Great, okay. So we talked about client libraries, talked about the spec. Things we haven't really talked about are integrations, and a lot of the work in OpenTelemetry actually happens in integrations, which is making this work with other libraries. Exporters, we talked about. This is vendors that want to ship an exporter, or rather want to ship instrumentation code from an application out to the back end. And then we talked about the collector, which is, you'll see in a second, a big separate thing from the library. So client libraries, this is the thing doing the actual work. You can see we have tracing, metrics, and then logs, hopefully. If you're interested in logs, come talk to us too, because we have work to do in the future on logs. And this will also do stuff like resource detection, where if you have certain environment variables, it will find them and put them as attributes on your traces. The specification describes how the client libraries work. So if you are writing your own client library in some new language, you're going to follow the spec, and then a lot of the work in the client libraries gets pushed up to the spec. If it's not clear how something should be implemented or why it's designed this way, we have a conversation in the specs repo. Exporters. We showed in the example, it's possible to configure multiple exporters. If you're exporting to the collector, which we'll talk about in a second, you can actually swap out your exporters without restarting your application. And then integrations handle context propagation. They handle integrations with other libraries and services. So one big use case here is that if you're using a library that, say, integrates with a database, you might want that library either to be instrumented using OpenTelemetry or for there to be some integration that wraps that library so that when you make a call to the database, we generate a span, right? And we maybe do things like include the query plan as an attribute of that span. Finally, we have the collector or agent. Especially if you've used other APMs, you're probably used to seeing an agent or a sidecar that runs with your application that does some work choosing which spans to sample or choosing how to aggregate metrics. So we do a lot of this in a separate component called the collector, and it's possible to run the collector both as an agent that runs along with your application and as a whole separate standalone service that does the aggregation and another layer of export out to different backends. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So after seeing this talk and some other talks at this conference about OpenTelemetry, you're probably thinking, how do I get involved? I got to get involved now. And there's a number of ways that you can get started getting involved, and there's a number of personas that Chris talked about of where you would be coming from. Myself, working at Postmates and chairing the observability working group in the Erlang Ecosystem Foundation, come from a user and app developer who uses these libraries way of thinking. So we have a unique perspective compared to the people working for APM vendors. And it would be great to get more end users involved as early as possible, working with this and trying it out and developing within the different components. So some of you might already be involved, which if so, thank you and keep it up. There's more ways than just code that you can be contributing. You can start telling your friends and coworkers, write blog posts, and if you've only been contributing in code or use and filing bugs, you should also check out the special interest groups and look at attending some of the Zoom meetings and getting more deeply involved with the project. If you're thinking about starting to use OpenTelemetry, you should head over to the website, which has some docs for a quick start in a number of languages like Ruby and Go. If you don't find a quick start for your language, you should check out the GitHub repos. A number of them have some README information on how to get started or dig through tests, open issues. If you don't find anything, and people will help fill in, and get on our Gitter channels and start asking questions if you can't find a way to get started. If you're already using OpenTracing or OpenCensus, like many of you are, it's a good time to start looking at the future of those projects, which is OpenTelemetry, seeing how it fits your needs or doesn't, and bring those concerns up with the community. And definitely check out the OpenTelemetry and OpenCensus shims, which will provide a way to keep your OpenTelemetry or OpenCensus code intact and still talk the OpenTelemetry data format. So if you're looking to start contributing today, first you can check out our Get Involved page on the website, and then find the repo that you're interested in taking part in, fork it, and start hacking away. You can look for good issues to get started with by searching in the repo's issues by the tag good first issues, or if you simply find something interesting or missing, dig in, talk in the Gitter channel, and get some feedback from people who are working on it as well, and start hacking away. If your org wants to give support to OpenTelemetry, talk to us after this presentation, come up to us, and we'll talk about how that can work, or join us in the Gitter community channel, say hi, and someone will get back to you eventually, very quickly, with how you can do that.
Thank you, Tristan. So as Tristan mentioned, there are other initiatives that we all participate in, like OpenTelemetry is an evolving project, and we try to keep up with the modern trends on how to monitor applications, how to observe applications. Some of those trends are stable enough, some of the concepts are stable enough for us to put them in the standardization bodies. And W3C TraceContext is one of the initiatives that many OpenTelemetry participants also contribute to. This W3C TraceContext, just today, it hit another milestone of maturity. It's almost a final specification. So 1 more month and it will be final. So it happened today, which is great. Okay. I'm here and I need to describe what it means. So W3C TraceContext is a format, protocol, how you propagate context for distributed tracing from one component to another. And this specification describes semantic of this field, of the context, and the format it needs to be serialized and deserialized to. And it also talks about interoperability between multiple vendors that may monitor one component and another component. So it's a very powerful thing, and we felt it stable enough to put it in the standard body and make sure that everybody, not only people doing observability, but also people owning platforms, service meshes, and proxies can also participate and help us with that. And final, thank you, Morgan.
I just wanted to clarify. There are different phases of things becoming a W3C standard. By almost final, we mean there haven't been any changes to the spec in, I don't know, 6 months or a year. This is just it going from being a editor's draft to being the actual final approved W3C spec. It is something you can depend on today. It does not mean we're just closing some sort of loops on it.
Thank you. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about non-code participation. We want you to get involved and to get started with it, but sometimes you don't want to code, you just want to talk to us, and this is also considered participation. We're actively looking for feedback. So contrary to the picture here, we have no way to say whether you using this application, OpenTelemetry at all or not, what environment you use in OpenTelemetry for, what features you like and what features you don't ever use. And this kind of feedback is also participation in the project. Give us, come to us and tell us what you like and what you don't like, and we'll help you. So before we wrap up and switch to Q&A session, we have an extended Q&A session today with many governance members. I want to just describe what you just saw. We walk through structure of the project, how we operate, how we define the vision for the project. We also walk through architecture of a project and what components we ship in first release of OpenTelemetry. It's a lot of complexity, but we try to simplify this complexity for you. And it's a lot of components, so first release will be a major one. And then we walk through the ways how you can participate and what you need to do to come and work with us. And now we will switch to Q&A, and we will invite more people on a podium, and we're happy to answer any of your questions.
I know there are one or two others who are going to be joining a bit late. I think Constance is on her way. And of course, this being the last day of the conference, there's some people who already had to disappear. There's Bogdan.
Aloha.
So I think we got almost everybody. Nope, I think we're good.
Do you need questions?
Yeah, well, first we should introduce the people who weren't on stage.
Okay.
Is it not working?
Working? Working. My name is Bogdan. I work for Google. I was one of the first person that did the OpenCensus, and then also part of the steering committee of the merging project called OpenTelemetry. And now I'm one of the technical committee and also part of the governance.
My name's Ted. I work at Lightstep. I come from the OpenTracing branch of the family. I'm on the governance committee these days. Mostly I work on the specification, and I try to facilitate the project. So if you're interested in getting involved, you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to plug you in and answer your questions.
I'm Sarah Novotny, and I came from the completely neutral branch of the merger, in the sense that I was the 5th person on the original committee that brought the 2 projects together. So I was the tiebreaker if OpenCensus or OpenTracing was, if there was factionalization. But there really wasn't. It was kind of awesome. Anyway, so I've been helping with governance and setting up and bringing together the 2 projects, and we'll continue on the steering or the governance committee over the next couple of years as it transitions to a healthy, happy open source project.
So I think now we can take any questions from the audience. We can happy to answer both technical questions, questions about project direction, anything you want. Complaints about the weather.
As someone that has been using telemetry but more explicitly, is there any recommendation to start and build a stack from scratch? I know you were referring to getting started, but that's one thing, getting a library. It's a different to say, okay, I just want to get a full stack there and start experimenting. Is there an easy path?
Yeah, we talked a bit about this yesterday. I don't know, Sergey or Chris, do you want to expand on it?
So when you're talking full stack, are you talking about infrastructure piece of it or application piece of it? Everything? Yeah. So in the first release, we will concentrate on application monitoring, including application tracing and application metrics. And this will be like a topic of the first release. And then later, we will beef up all our offerings, and like collector will start understanding more infrastructure kind of metrics and more we will kind of extend it into like a wider range of telemetry sources, I would say. But
Is there a help chart that I could just install a full-blown thing that actually views and just put my app on top? Because
so OpenTelemetry is about collecting data. We can gather a lot of telemetry sources and bring it all together. One thing is you need to add backend to this mix. So you need to choose which backend you'll be using. You can use either open source backends like Jaeger or Prometheus, but you need to manage them, these components yourself. But then you can bring some managed solutions like telemetry vendor solutions, and then it will give you more kind of insights and more data analysis on top of it.
it was just a suggestion, like someone that started from scratch, if I'm able to say, I've got a Kubernetes, it's empty, I want to start, right? Okay, I'm going to write my app, but then I would like to, like for the neophyte, the guy that never done it, being able to have these dependency already kind of defined. Because what I'm getting from this is, I need to say, okay, what backend I'm going to use, and then starting to stitch all this together before starting being able to take advantage of this.
Yes, so functionally OpenTelemetry is the instrumentation portion of this, and this is the piece that goes, through libraries, through SDKs into your application. But then there is a visualization layer, which is, the idea is that this is the common language that many visualization layers can look at. So it's more difficult than building like, here's the full stack and I just drop my app onto it.
Oh, I was going to just add one extra thing there, which is for languages that support something like an auto installer, like Java has like a Java agent pattern, for example, we'll be providing auto installation. So if you have an application, you can just auto install OpenTelemetry and it will add library support and instrumentation support for you. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, service meshes are all the rage these days, and so I know some of them are OpenTracing enabled, and hopefully will become OpenTelemetry enabled, so you'll just be able to turn that on, and you'll start getting data without actually touching your application code.
Hi. My question concerns the API design and development you've gone through. Have you run into cases where you have to present a least common denominator interface? Are there escape hatches if there's a particular vendor that allows you to express things that you can't capture what the API has stated?
Yeah. So it's definitely the case that we need to where I see a sort of least common denominator in the API is actually more around handling edge cases than it is about vendor features so much. Traditionally, though, you're able to, at least in OpenTracing, you were able to kind of typecast to a vendor-specific thing if you had it. We really don't want people to be doing that, though. So we consider that to be a bad smell if you're feeling like you're having to go around the API to get something done. But one thing that does feel good is we've had a lot of like in production testing at this point for both OpenCensus and OpenTracing. So when it comes to designing this API, we're not really doing it from scratch. So we feel pretty confident that it is state of the art as far as the state of the art today.
And I mean, philosophy of OpenTelemetry is we really believe that all extensibility points that you'll ever need will be provided as small callbacks, small extensibility points. We call it small hooks, but there is always a big hook. You can replace entire thing and like put a completely new SDK. And we keep this door open for larger innovations.
Hey, so during the talk today, you guys teased a little bit about logging and how that may find its way into OpenTelemetry in the future. So is there any more information you can give us at this time?
Yeah, not a whole lot new now. So for anyone who was in the OpenCensus community prior to the merger, we were working on a logging specification. We had like a product requirements document out for logging that a number of vendors and large users had commented on. Given the merger between OpenCensus and OpenTracing and OpenTelemetry, that took a back seat because getting the communities aligned was a much bigger goal. Logging is, once again, something that's certainly come up. Maintainers of Kubernetes have been asking us about it, and I think some of the vendors also have been asking about it, just given that some of them are expanding into the logging space as well. To be blunt, I don't think we have any fully formed thoughts about it. It's something that early next year we're just going to pick up again as a brainstorming event and go from there. The priority at the moment is finishing the metrics and tracing implementations for the libraries and getting those out into beta and then GA.
Yeah, kind of actually on the status of the items you have in priority for the roadmap. For those of us who are already using an exporter to, say, Jaeger for our open tracing and stuff like that, what's the status on bridges or library interfaces so that we can continue to, export to those but adopt the OpenTelemetry standard?
Yeah. So it's a hard requirement for this project to have full backwards compatibility with both OpenTracing and OpenCensus. The idea being you shouldn't have to make a gigantic all-at-once change in order to switch from from OpenTracing to OpenTelemetry. For example, the switch would be first install the OpenTelemetry SDK, and it also will, because OpenTracing is just an API that tracers can bind to, the OpenTelemetry tracer just binds to the OpenTracing API. So all of your OpenTracing code will work with the new SDK, and then you can progressively transition your code over to using the OpenTelemetry API. We in basically every major language we have a version of a bridge because we want to make sure we don't get to the end of the API and discover that we've done something that's painted us into a corner.
Real quick, if someone asks a follow-up and they weren't mic'd on the follow-up, make sure you repeat the question because no one back here can hear things. All right, we have another question.
So how do existing Prometheus, like custom Prometheus metrics that may already exist and fit into this kind of ecosystem?
What do you mean by custom?
I guess application-specific ones.
How do existing Prometheus metrics fit into the...
Right. So like you just already have Prometheus metrics in your code.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's a very good question. So I think for the time being, there is a big difference between metrics and traces, at least the way how Prometheus did metrics before. They are context agnostic, so you can easily have inside the same application metrics recorded with two different libraries and they will still work. That's not true for tracing, so one of the major difference between these. So far we would recommend, if you want to do the transition between the Prometheus metrics to OpenTelemetry metrics, for time being you will run both. You will have both libraries and until you finish your transition. We do have in our collector a way to scrape Prometheus metrics that will transform everything into OpenTelemetry. So that will we do the transformation outside the process. That's because the Prometheus client currently does not allow us to have a hook inside the Prometheus to export our format. We are pretty compatible with Prometheus, and it's one of our goals to be compatible with them. And we will support directly exporting to Prometheus from our library, and we also gonna support metrics, which is hopefully coming soon.
I'll ask. I'll have a comment question since Liz isn't here. One other thing we're trying to do that I don't know if got on that slide was provide a lot of educational resources for people. So we've been creating and we've been running these OpenTelemetry workshops at a few events. Expect to see more of those next year, but all of those resources that we're creating for those workshops are Apache 2 licensed under the same terms as everything else, and the intention is that you could go back into your organization or to your local meetup or your local technical group and then run OpenTelemetry workshops and trainings yourself. So if that's something that interests anyone, there's room in the community for you too.
So I saw the demo yesterday, some hello world examples. Are you going to do more advanced examples like async tracing?
Yes.
When?
Synchronous?
That was both projects.
Yeah, we didn't have the mutex locked. So in OpenCensus we had a nice example. It's called Hipster Shop. It was built for Google Next as an example app for a bunch of features that Google wants to show. And I think having something very similar with that in OpenTelemetry with more like that's an app with 7 languages, 8 or 9 different microservices with async, with everything that you can imagine. I think that will be very useful. I don't think we will be able to cover all the possible examples in all the languages, but having some examples for async, for example, yeah, we'll have 2 or 3 languages with async, not all of them. But having an application that is like that people can understand and can see, I think it's very valuable, and we will invest into that after GA.
But it's important for us to understand your particular scenario. So if you have some question and you can figure out how to do that, and you need a demo, just tell us on the Gitter or whatever, and it will give us a strong signal that this is kind of scenarios that we need to talk more about.
Hi, so this is maybe more of a question for the OpenCensus, since that's where the exporters are coming from more. Any thoughts on where would you put the exports? Like how much would you sort of merge metrics and traces going up, like up to a data center level and then export from there, or is it more put the exporter on sort of every single service basically?
So I'm not 100% sure I understand the complete question. Just to rephrase
I think I understand. Okay. So OpenTelemetry provides a complete set of components that enables you to send telemetry to any backend you choose. And you can start, like easiest integration is with out-of-process collector, because it's easy to switch and you can do it at any moment of your application lifecycle. And then if you cannot run any external process, we have in-process exporters. And if vendor implemented this in-process export, then you can use that exporter and send data directly to the backend. But then we have all sorts of combinations, like some people running Prometheus metrics and taking them right locally, so they can do like very fast scale out and scale in, and all like longer term metrics will be sent to the backend. So you can do all sorts of these scenarios as well. We also saw people doing 3-tier architecture when they have sidecar collector first, and then collector that aggregates across entire cluster. And this scenario allows to do very primitive sampling on sidecar, but then like way more elaborate sampling decision, like tail-based sampling, when you sample based on a failure in a very last service in a cluster level collector and only send this data to the backend. That saves you a lot of money on telemetry backend.
Hello.
Hi, sorry, I was doing track host for something else, but my name is Constance. I'm from Splunk. We used to be Omniscient. Super excited about the community. We all need your input, and I don't know what else I'm supposed to say.
You're also a member of the governance committee.
And I'm on the governance committee, that word too. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, so my question is, if I'm currently having an application that's using Prometheus client for metrics, what's my incentive to move to OpenTelemetry for metrics?
Okay, I'll take this because I was probably the guilty person that pushed for having metrics inside OpenTelemetry. One of the major difference, and I don't know if you try to use OpenCensus, we do have our metrics are context aware. So, which means there are certain things that you can do by passing context around. For example, if you are recording a metric in service A, which is called by service B, you can inject labels from the other service, which is something that Prometheus does not support, and this is something that we had in Google for a long time, and we thought that it's super useful, and we have clear examples inside Google where this was super useful for us. And yeah, so that's probably the major difference between us and Prometheus. Anything else is almost the same. So if you record your metric and you just configure to not be context aware, like to just not extract anything from the context, then you'll have exactly Prometheus, and probably that's not going to be a big reason for you to change. But if you do want to have the cool feature of being able to propagate labels between inside the process or between processes, that's something that Prometheus does not have.
Yes,
and none of the metrics libraries so far. That's why we added yet another one, and I hope is not an N+1. I hope it will become the one.
Yeah, this was one of my favorite features of OpenCensus when I started working on clients for OpenCensus, and being able to have that context of, HTTP status code, what method was called in one place shared, that gets used by my metrics as dimensions, as well as show up in my trace spans when I look at them. It's really very useful.
But again, it's not a competition. We're working with them and trying to resolve like how we can get a single guidance for end users and like for developers, and guide them with the transition.
Yeah. Really, the only thing I would add there is this is about when you have like an observability system that has both tracing and metrics in it, you end up with this context propagation, and that's the real difference, is being context aware.
So have any of you thought about doing like a mini con at one of your offices where you invite people to do like a whiteboard session for maybe 3 days to maybe a week? And if so, when can we expect that?
Oh, I guess like vendor hat on, I'm sorry. Yes, or like, but also like, as I'm saying as a vendor, but also like we definitely talk about how important it is to build a community. I think we just have some other bucket list things right now we need to do in terms of administrative stuff, like getting to incubating status, but it's definitely something that we care about, because we know that in terms of like, if we don't address the end user's needs and we actually don't get the feedback in terms of what's useful, and like if there's certain things that are really difficult to use, we're not going to be able to be the successful project we want to be. So we want to do it. We just haven't scheduled it yet.
Yeah, there'll definitely be something. We just have to actually spend the time to plan it, which requires us to not be at KubeCon.
Which actually opens up another thing. If any of you want to help in that, please just reach out, because it sounds like Morgan and Constance at least want to see this happen.
We already thought about having something like that in summer, but because of the merger, we keep postponing it until we have kind of a beta version for our libraries, because it will be a bit premature right now to talk about a bunch of the things.
Yeah, and New Relic and Lightstep are talking about hosting regular meetups up in Portland. So, Portland, Oregon peeps, say hi.
You work at New Relic.
I kind of have a question about the context propagation and the W3C process.
Yeah.
And kind of my question is like, do you see like less cloud native software getting involved here? Like Postgres as a database server, for example. You know, there is no way in the wire protocol to say, hey, here's a trace or context propagation. Like, so how do you think about these kind of like non-cloud native things? I mean, Postgres is cool, but like MySQL, and there's a lot of databases out there that kind of don't use HTTP. How should we think about that?
So I cannot give any commitment here, but we're talking with TDS guys. It's SQL Server people, and we adding W3C protocol in TDS. So we clearly see interest, and like from NoSQL and like from storage guys. Like, I'm talking on behalf of Microsoft because like I work there and I work with those people. Like storage people also want to give you information about how your transaction went and why it was slow. So we're adding trace context there as well. Like we're using some custom format right now, but we're switching to W3C eventually. And it's kind of the same kind of ballpark of people.
Yeah. And I would add there's just a little bit of color. When it comes to doing context propagation, some protocols have metadata in the protocol. So there's a place to put this kind of information. And some other protocols like Memcache, for example, don't have a metadata concept. So it's much harder for the protocols that don't have any concept of metadata. It becomes a lot trickier to decide where you're actually going to put this information. So, but the ones that do have metadata, it's just much more straightforward.
Yeah, like Kafka has headers, and so that's a good place just to standardize on how those should go in there and get read and linked around. And I think I had a conversation with people at Rabbit at one point, so that might be coming.
Hi, I'm Yuri Shkuro from Uber. I'm a member of the governing board and used to work a lot on OpenTracing, so now OpenTelemetry.
Hey, so I've just put OpenTracing in my application. That was received very well. And now I've discovered OpenTelemetry and that we should be switching over to that. So that's interesting. We get a lot of support for metrics and stuff as well. But now I've heard the term open metrics being thrown around. So how does that relate to OpenTelemetry?
I will take it. For the moment, OpenMetrics as a project just defines a data model for the metrics. It does not define a client or is not a client. They want to, so there will be multiple clients OpenMetrics compatible, and we will be one of them. So in that regard, I don't think there is any overlap between the two projects. We are client libraries that we are helping you instrument your application or your service. They are a data model, which we will support and we will expose that.
So another way of saying that is you could get your metrics data exported in OpenMetrics format or Prometheus format or StatsD or OpenTelemetry. We want to be agnostic on that front.
And I'll add one additional thing to that, which is we have written shims to do the backward compatibility to OpenTelemetry, from OpenTelemetry to OpenTracing, so it's not a big rewrite for you immediately.
There you go. There's also the collector, where the collector actually supports like Zipkin, Jaeger, all these other things. So if you just want to do in forms of like first doing data collection and using your existing instrumentation, that is like the first step forward in terms of adopting OpenTelemetry. So you have one collector that supports metrics and tracing. It'll eventually support logs. And so that could be your first journey towards helping us grow the community. And then after, update your instrumentation to whatever, say if you want to use the OpenTelemetry metrics or a different protocol. Anything else?
So are there any plans on adding specific information to spans at either individual span level or an overall level? so that we can potentially lock down who can view which spans for security purposes.
Are you talking about accessing the span data, or are you talking? Okay, so first, if I understand correctly the question, you are talking about annotating who is accessing or who is viewing some span information, some span data, correct? That's probably something at the backend level where you should have support for some kind of ACLs or some kind of logging, like security logging for access logs or whatever it's called. I think from our perspective, we will produce the data and we can probably make sure that we do not send the data in two places and we just send to the trusted backend that you configure, but that's probably everything that we can do from the client perspective.
So I can tell from Microsoft perspective that we have a lot of experience in sending telemetry from Windows, and all regulators from the entire world looking at this telemetry, trying to understand, like trying to catch us by the hand and like saying you're doing something wrong. So we have a lot of experience attributing data. Now the question is, do you want to take this experience and move it to OpenTelemetry project? Is it a separate one? So maybe we can just be better off by doing it in backend and provide a custom solution that you can install on top of OpenTelemetry. But if it will be a large demand, this is one of the areas we at Microsoft really interested in. So we can bring this expertise to the project.
Actually, there's support within the OpenTelemetry collector that, because it's processing all the spans, right? There's redaction filters too. So like in terms of like PII, we've partnered with some people who are using OpenTelemetry that they redact in terms of like if they have a secret key in their trace or user ID. There's also like one of the things we have an issue is to actually hash the actual values, and so that way then you can like hash it so no one, like we can't read it, but then after once you have control people who actually have the key, then you can decode it yourself on the other side. And so that's part of the collector. So the collector has a lot of powerful things you can at least transform the data in terms of what you want to do.
And I know we've also talked about putting redaction in the SDK itself. So like before it ever gets to the exporter, already the attributes that you want to remove have been removed from the span. And this is like, because even if you control the exporter, you might still not want anything that you know you want redacted to hit the exporter layer in case you're going to swap the exporter out and then lose access control.
I don't see any other questions. I think we have some more time. Do people just want to go to the line and talk about like one thing that they would either like to see moving forward in terms of where people can specifically get involved, or just what they're most excited about in Hotel, since we have everyone here?
I can start. One thing that I really like about OpenTelemetry is the fact that we pull the context propagation framework below the observability layers. So observability is just a function that uses context propagation rather than providing it. And that opens up a lot of other functionality that can be built. And if you're interested in that, there was a talk at Observability Summit this Monday about various things you can do with context propagation. They have nothing to do with observability. They can like debugging in production, testing in production, other type of things. And so OpenTelemetry will contain that layer for now. In the future, we may move it out, but that's like one feature that I'm really looking forward to. And Uber is a big user of that feature already, even though it's in OpenTracing.
Okay, I'm going to say two, just because we're gonna try to hype up the crew. One thing actually that's really exciting about OpenTelemetry, and I think that the problem that it suffers a lot in terms of projects now is like we have one metric, there's a metrics, there's a log, there's a tracing, there's all these different conventions and projects out there. But like OpenTelemetry is kind of like slowly turning into the superpower where we get to actually combine all three, right? And you can say you can combine even more. And so like that's actually where like observability is going to. It's like not really doing any form of like one-dimensional monitoring observability. It's how you combine all three of that. And so like this project is that first step towards combining, when you add metrics to your traces and after have nice integration with your logs, like that is just really cool. The second thing is, I would say, auto instrumentation. In terms of like, we're probably, a lot of people here at KubeCon already working on the cloud and have a lot more of like the faster iteration in terms of adding a lot of frameworks and libraries on the fly. And auto instrumentation is a really good spot to actually help people bypass the initial painful part of instrumentation. Because as we all probably know, getting buy-in in terms of instrumentation takes a really long time as an organization. And also if you don't have the experience in terms of like knowing what to observe, auto instrumentation can at least fill that initial gap in terms of like seeing how things are and then identifying, oh, I know maybe I need to instrument this one piece of code because that one's actually really slow, or I need to do a little more things there because there's so many issues. And so auto instrumentation and OpenTelemetry as a superhero.
Okay, I know this is Tristan's beat, but I want to put in a plug for working on the language clients. Hopefully we have a couple different fun communities that are easy to start working in. I can speak for Python if you're interested in working on the client, or especially if you have another library that you work on that you would like to add an integration for. That's something that we're always looking for, and we need a lot of different people working on it because we need domain expertise in the different languages. So if you have it, please come talk to us or find us online.
Yeah, what I'm most excited about and why I got involved in OpenCensus and why the Erlang Ecosystem Foundation is a part of this is to bring the barrier of using Erlang or Elixir in a company down a little bit, because often you go in there and you become, if you were able to already have an Erlang system there in the company, it's often its own corner, it doesn't talk to anything else, it's not able to use the same APM vendors. They eventually just want to get rid of it because it's a pain to deal with. So having these standards that vendors start supporting allows us to be just another citizen within the Kubernetes cluster and talking to the same vendors to visualize and get your logs, metrics, and traces, and we don't have to be the oddball out.
So I'm mostly joking at work, like people asking what you're doing, and I'm saying I'm actively eliminating my job. So I really hope that in some time there will be a talk at KubeCon saying how to collect telemetry and nobody shows up, because telemetry already is there. Like, why would you talk about how to collect telemetry? It's built in everywhere, and I hope it will happen soon, and it is what I'm working towards too.
I'll echo Chris's sentiments. I'm excited for the language client libraries to reach beta and then GA early next year, and then to see people starting to write integrations. Projects like this are only as powerful as the number of integrations that are written for them. So once we establish that quality level on the language libraries, I want to see those integrations start flowing in.
And I'll reiterate the integrations from a slightly different perspective, which is this will only be as successful as we want it to be and fulfill the vision that we have for it if we get really good user feedback, we understand what you need, and we have you come help us and join us and engage with this project. It can be commits, it can be questions, it can be comments on discussions. Participate, because that's really the power of doing this in open source and standardizing. And I want to also say thank you to all of the project leads who've been participating in this so far, because taking two competing or at least slightly contentious groups that have overlapping projects and merging them together for the benefit of the user is huge. And so we're asking you all to help us make this as successful as we think it can be.
Reiterate that. Something that I'm excited about and have been excited about for a long time is having the ability to instrument open source code directly. So as someone who's had to maintain open source libraries in the past, the observability was always a sticking point. I want to report an error, I want to tell the user how to operate it. Just emitting a log, and suddenly I'm like, well, what logging library do I use? If I just pick one and everyone picks one, do these libraries then compose together? That doesn't really work very well. So I was always frustrated having to just spew stuff to standard out because there just wasn't a great way to plug a real system into my open source code. And the way we factored out OpenTelemetry, that's now possible. So I'm really hoping to see library and framework developers starting to take ownership of their own observability, not just putting in the metrics and the trace points, but thinking more about shipping playbooks for their users, explaining them how to tune their libraries, what to do in the event of errors, like how to observe their own stuff. I think that will work much better if the owners of those libraries are thinking about that. And I think they'll be able to think about that or be more interested in thinking about it if they've got tools that let them actually do it. So that's what I'm excited about.
I think having telemetry everywhere is something that I found very compelling when I joined Google like 8 years ago. I used to work for Adobe and we had zero telemetry. We didn't know what's happening. We didn't have alerts. First time when I saw alerts was when I joined Google. Yeah, so having the experience that I had when I joined Google and the revolution that I had in my mind, I hope that's going to happen with all the products, and it's not going to be only in Google, Uber, and the big tech companies. It should be everywhere.
All right, any other questions? We got one more question.
Do it.
So we created a client called a tunable sampler for your Java OpenCensus library, and was wondering, I know you have your exporter that you're planning on doing some sort of tunable sampling, but do you have the ability to do it at the client level as well, so that if people aren't running K8s or if they don't want to install some sort of process running, that the actual code that's on deployed could do it dynamically without having to restart or deploy a Java app, etc. And we did submit a 20-page paper to your spec as well, so all that's up there.
Wow.
Can we have it as homework and get back to you?
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay.
I think one thing I can say to that is that some of that functionality exists in Jaeger clients, the ability to sort of affect sampling from the backend and for configuration. And Bogdan gave me his word that that functionality will be supported in OpenTelemetry. So, because our goal is, as a Jaeger project maintainer, we want to eventually stop supporting Jaeger clients because they are not going to be any different from OpenTelemetry, and then we will do that like as soon as there is a feature parity, and that's one of the features that definitely need to exist in the client library.
I think already in 2 languages I saw people start working on what they call remote sampler, which is just going to be an implementation of what we call a sampler in our ecosystem that will talk to a IP port, whatever, and will just configure itself at the runtime. So yes, we will support that. Now there is a question about what protocol that will talk, and we may have to have remote sampler for every backend, because every backend may want to configure different things and may talk different protocols. And I don't know if we have time until GA to define yet another protocol for that, but definitely we'll have one for Jaeger, and if you already have one, please help us with the protocol that you support, and we will be more than happy to help you have that functionality included. So from the perspective of plugins, we already are plugin ready for having this, and we'll make the demo that we'll have, or the example that we'll have will be for Jaeger, because we committed that that's going to be supported, fully supported in OpenTelemetry.
We have need for the remote sampling feature with Jaeger to adopt OpenTelemetry, the collector internally, which we want to do. I was actually just commenting on this on the issue for the collector. In Jaeger, just a proxy. Is it going to be more complicated in the collector? Are you going to have to like abstract it to the OpenTelemetry standard and define that? Like basically, can I PR a proxy to Jaeger backend now, or are you guys going to define something more complete than that?
So, I think there are 2 things. Remote sampling, if I understand correctly, you want to affect that at the client level.
The client just has an endpoint that it checks, and the endpoint is generally the Jaeger agent, which proxies back. So
correct.
It's a very like simple change, unless of course there's a lot more going on with OpenTelemetry, the collector itself, like you want to define your own abstraction?
So first we want to support our library to talk directly to the Jaeger agent, okay? So what we will do, we already support an Jaeger exporter. That exporter will be configured to push to the Jaeger agent, and then the remote sampler specific for Jaeger will talk with the same endpoint and retrieve the same data. Now, if you want to put a collector as well in this infrastructure, I think we haven't made yet any design around that. We are focusing right now to make our client libraries just be able to replace the Jaeger client library, which means the agent that Jaeger has to be there for the moment.
I was just wondering, given what you, Ted and Sergey talked about this goal of having telemetry ubiquitous with libraries and frameworks, for any library framework authors, do you have any advice, in terms of timing of when to jump on and start using the API, or just best practices, or is that just an evolving story?
Well, I really, really would like to see people testing it before we say it's 1.0 and not use 1.0 as the reason to get involved in it. I would say a number of these languages all have tracing fully baked in and metrics about to be. So it's a good time to really start kicking the tires on it now. We're hoping to be moving into beta rapidly. We'd like to wrap up this specification work by end of year. And March, I think, is a stability point that we're aiming for. Though giant asterisks, we are engineers, our ability to estimate time is poor. Yeah, but that's what we're aiming. That's what, yeah. But 2 weeks, yeah, 2 weeks.
Always
oh, one month.
Always double the time.
Yeah, so that's the caveat, but we're aiming for March.
So not to talk about the spec, because I know you want to finalize it in the next month or so.
Yeah.
I know you have this term called baggage. So do you have a way where within a corporate infrastructure, systems can identify themselves, so that way downstream systems can then say, hey, I'm going to stop the trace because sample is true?
Yeah.
Do you have that ability?
No.
I'll submit a ticket.
Yeah. This is actually the baggage mechanism is actually very basic. It's more like just basic propagation, and one issue is that there is no really standardized concept of security zones or network boundaries in a way that you could actually grab. So I think it's an open question how best to do things like ceasing baggage propagation. So yeah, please get into it.
I think one thing that we can offer from our API library implementation is for the samplers, give access to the baggages. So at the least, again, coming back to the same question, for some implementation of remote sampler that wants to use the baggages, they should be able to do that without having to change our core library.
Any other questions? Okay. I think that's it. So we'll stick around for a little bit to answer any in-person questions you have. But thank you for attending this and our other talks on OpenTelemetry at KubeCon. Have a great conference and great trip home.